There are more seats on the sides over here, so just kind of move in that direction. So.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to get started. I'll stand up just for a minute. Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. Please take your seat. How wonderful to have Noam Chomsky back here with us. This will be our third interview between the two of us. One of them a long time ago in 1974, focused mostly on anarchism and other current ills in society that were then wide-ranging. Now we're visiting again with another wave of turbulence and problematic issues. But there's a lot to be gained from discussing these. There's a lot to begin to find hopeful ways forward, paths through the thicket, and so forth. And that's what we'll be mostly discussing today. For the 3 or 4 people out there who don't know Noam Chomsky, I'm going to give an introduction. In terms of the power, range, novelty, and influence of his thought, Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive today. I'm delighted that he could be here to join us in Boston for a special session entitled A Conversation with Noam Chomsky. This session will be a conversational interview followed by an opportunity for our audience participation through a Q&A period. As most geographers know, Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. A small sampling of his numerous publications include the book that I was first introduced to him by, American Power and the New Mandarins, then a lot of linguistics works, including Cartesian linguistics, a number of political books, well over 100 books, I think, For Reasons of State, The Political Economy of Human Rights, On Power and Ideology, Language and the Problems of Knowledge, Profit over People, New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind, Understanding Power, and most recently, the Requiem for the American Dream. Noam's work on the nature of human language and communication has profoundly transformed the field of linguistics and greatly influenced science and philosophy more broadly. The so-called Chomskyan revolution generated intellectual reverberations across many disciplines, including geography, anthropology, education, psychology, and genetics. Noam Chomsky is one of the most frequently cited scholars of all time. Noam also has been an impassioned critic of American foreign policy and of corporate and government power. His now classic book on the role of intellectuals in American society, American Power and the New Mandarins, greatly influenced the debate on the Vietnam War and continues to prompt examination of the complicity of intellectuals in implementing policies entrenched in entrenched power to this day. His arguments resonate strongly in the context of the rise of new authoritarian regimes at this time. It's a wonderful honor and great pleasure to welcome Noam Chomsky. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start out on one topic other than Trump, and because if we get on that topic, we may never get off it for the rest of the interview. So, I'd first like to learn from you, Noam, a little bit about what you think about the role of human rights today. Do you see human rights as being able to play a role as sort of a foundational framework for us as we move forward? some form of grounding, or the abuse of those areas been too wide-reaching? I pose this question in the context of one of the major themes of this particular meeting of geographers. We have more than 9,000 geographers assembled here from around the world. And that theme is mainstreaming human rights in geography and the AAG, our association. This has grown out of about 10 years of work that we've been doing with a number of groups from Amnesty International and many human rights organizations to the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. One of the outgrowths of that has been a very interesting coalition that's come together called the Coalition for Science and Human Rights. And this has brought together over 40 scientific associations from chemistry to the social sciences. And we at the AG have played a central role in the development of that coalition over the years. So what do you see as potentially promising strategies for advancing human rights, and should we be doing that, or should we focus on something else?
Well, there is, of course, a gold standard on human rights, the Universal Declaration, 1948. Theoretically, states adhere to it. In practice, that's far from true. The Universal Declaration, as I'm sure you know, has three components of equal significance. One is civil and political rights, the first one. The second is social and economic rights. The third is community and cultural rights. The stand of the United States is pretty explicit. In principle, the United States supports the first component. We can ask about practice, but at least in principle, it's advocated. There are quite interesting questions about practice, about, say, the history of what's called democracy promotion and so on. Could go into that if you're interested. But at least in principle, it's advocated. The third component, cultural community rights, is simply ignored. There's almost no discussion or comment on it. The second, social and economic rights, is an interesting one and very much on the agenda constantly, especially Article 25, which calls for, declares that the right to health care, decent jobs, reasonable employment, so on and so forth, are all fundamental human rights. The U.S. has a position on that. It was stated pretty blandly by Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, Jeane Kirkpatrick. She described this component of the Declaration as a letter to Santa Claus that was reiterated and expanded by her followers, Paula Dobriansky, Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Morris Abram, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission, in his case commenting on the right to development, which pretty much paraphrased Article 25. The U.S. alone refused to sign it. Abram called it a provocation, a dangerous provocation, an idea that has no basis in law or practice. Dobriansky dismissed the myth that social and economic rights are fundamental human rights. And we see it in practice. They were not alone, incidentally. The Russian ambassador, Vyshinsky, right at the outset, dismissed this as sort of a pious joke. So we're in good company. In practice, you can look at the records of the OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, roughly 30 rich countries. They have detailed annual reports on the what they call social justice, the extent to which members of the rich club observe the conditions on social justice enunciated in the Universal Declaration. The U.S. ranks way at the bottom, alongside of Mexico and Turkey, about 29th, I think, or so of the 30-some countries. And we see that in many ways. We're seeing it right now in debates in Washington. We see it in the fact that the United States is practically alone in the developed world in that it does not have some form of national health care except for the general public. But that's not because people don't want it. In fact, there was a poll just a couple of days ago which showed once again that given three options, what's called single payer here, meaning universal health care, the Republican proposal, the Affordable Care Act, the Republican proposal was opposed by a huge majority. The Affordable Care Act had moderate support, but majority support was for a public option, universal health care. That's been true for many years. It's one of the it's a very interesting fact about U.S. public opinion. When the question is asked in a reasonable way, as you know, polls depend a lot on how the questions are formulated. But if the questions are asked in a sort of a rational way, then quite typically people prefer universal health care. Sometimes with great enthusiasm. So toward the end of the Reagan years, for example, about 70% of the population thought that there should be a constitutional guarantee of health care, should be in the Constitution. And about 40% of the population thought it was already in the Constitution. Nobody knows what's in the Constitution except that it's a holy book with everything good, so must have universal health care. And there have been results like that for a long time. It's not discussed very much in the press, but when it is, the commentary is interesting. So, for example, when Kerry was running for president, the last debate was on social and economic policy. If you look back at the Times commentary, it says that Kerry didn't bring up any notion like public health care, national health care. And the reason they said is, interesting words, they said it has too little political support, which is correct. It is not supported by those who determine policy. The financial institutions, the pharmaceutical institutions, they don't support it, so it doesn't have political support. There is something called a population, but their views are not political support. And this, of course, bears on the first component of the Universal Declaration, civil and political rights, and about that there's quite a lot to say, but I don't want to drone on about it.
We're already trending into Trumpism, but let's back up just a little bit here. Excuse me. As I mentioned, one of the major themes of our meeting today is human rights, but not only the current provision, but how they might be applied to sort of day-to-day activities of academics, of people conducting research, people trying to anticipate what the outcomes of their research would be, and how to manage those kinds of tricky questions in terms of the practice of say geography, the practice of philosophy, the practice of many types of science. And of course, with lots of new technologies coming up, we run quickly into unintended consequences of technologies. We run quickly into unforeseen consequences, and of course, there's the wide range of intended consequences, or those that should have been foreseen. And this is somewhat close to my own heart because Earlier in my career, I developed and patented the first real-time interactive GPS and GIS systems, geographic information systems, which at that time had broad-based environmental applications that they were developed for. And now we see that you know, they're used now heavily in surveillance. They're used heavily in areas, essentially in modern warfare. In fact, most of our wars are fought now basically as one big, large-scale, real-time, interactive GPS GIS system. And so these questions are bedeviling, and they're also, I think, require us to engage them at various points. Yeah, once the genie's out of the bottle, what do you do?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a group within the American Geographical Society, the network of concerned geographers, which has been coming forward with petitions and proposals about exactly these issues, specifically about the cooperation of geographers with the military. GPS is an example. GPS, of course, was developed within the military, then offered to others, used for surveillance, for bombing, for all sorts of things. Geographers, of course, are very closely involved, just like anthropologists, with what are sometimes called human terrain issues. What does the military expect to do in particular areas? And that raises hard questions, which the group is raising, and I think should be taken very seriously. Their petition lists a series of specific proposals. I presume that you're taking account of them and taking them into consideration. I certainly think you should be. And for other professions, similar questions arise in quite a similar way for anthropology, and the anthropologists have taken some fairly strong positions about participating in, not participating in military actions addressing indigenous tribal communities, and others have very much the same concerns. There are some cases of human rights which we are all critically concerned with. They should be on the top of the agenda for everyone. That's the question of human survival, which is at stake now in a way that it has not been for the roughly 200,000 years in which Homo sapiens have been around. As, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we're now well into two new eras in human history. The nuclear age began in 1945. The Anthropocene, which the American Geological, the World Geological Association now decided to date at roughly the same time immediately after the Second World War, where human impact on the environment created essentially a new geological epoch. And these two threats are existential, imminent, and furthermore, we're racing towards magnifying them, which is very, as I've said many times, I find it really hard to find words to capture the fact that with eyes open, knowing what the consequences are, the United States is now separating itself from the world and racing towards the precipice of environmental catastrophe. The other great issue, nuclear war, tensions are building up at the Russian border. That's been increasing since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. NATO began to expand. Senior statesmen like George Kennan and others warned right away that NATO expansion is a disaster in the making for pretty obvious reasons. You can simply ask how the United States would be reacting if the Warsaw Pact were had taken over Latin America and was now approaching the Mexican border and the Canadian border. Of course, that's absolutely inconceivable. We would have had a terminal nuclear war long before this state arose, but it's now happening on the Russian border. Serious provocations on both sides. There is the best single monitor of the prospects for human survival, in my view, is the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Serious scientists, political analysts gather every year and try to do an analysis of how far we are from midnight. Midnight is terminal. The doomsday clock was established in 1947. At that point, the hand was 7 minutes to midnight. It's moved up and back over the years. The closest it came to midnight was 1953, when Russia and the United States exploded thermonuclear weapons. It's then changed. Now, a couple of weeks into the Trump term, the clock has been moved another half minute towards midnight, 2.5 minutes to midnight, the closest it's been since 1953. And now, as distinct from then, two major issues are raised by those who set the clock: the constant and growing threat of nuclear war and the ominous threat of environmental catastrophe, both issues of particular concern to geographers, but of great concern to every human being, anyone who cares about whether organized human life will survive on the planet.
Thanks. Have some of the issues that we talked about just now related to engagement with the military and so forth, is that an issue that's come up with linguists as well? You know, as you probably aware, a great deal of linguistics, or at least language training, is funded by the DoD.
Certainly did. Back in the early 1940s, when I was an undergraduate, a great deal of the linguistic work was being done in the Army language schools. This was during the Second World War. People were being taught languages where U.S. forces might be deployed. Not sure exactly how it worked out. I had a few personal experiences. A good friend of mine was sent to a Hungarian language school, and he was deployed in Korea, naturally, which actually has a kind of a weak connection with Hungarian way back many thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
But I suspect a lot of it was pretty much like that.
Yeah, we've also often been saved by large strategic plans going awry. So.
Yeah, but in later years, there are issues which I think are not very well understood. So take where I've been all my academic life, MIT. In the 1950s, when I got there, the Institute was overwhelmingly supported by the Pentagon. That was every part of it, including the libraries, the music department, everything else. Forget the exact figure, but could have been something like 90%. I was working in a lab that was 100% supported by the three armed services. And it also happened to be the lab which was the center of academic anti-war resistance. That's the lab where we started national tax resistance in 1965, helped organize the resistance support group, Resist, which still exists, which came to trial in the Spock trial a couple of years later. All of this was going on in a military lab, 100% supported by the three armed services, and there was of no concern to anyone, because what's not recognized very well is that the Pentagon from the 1950s through the 1970s and to an extent today was the US government industrial policy system. If you wanted to develop the high-tech economy of the future, the way it was done was to frighten the population into thinking the Russians are coming, and then put money into what became finally computers, the internet, lasers, microtechnology, the GPS. In fact, most of the high-tech economy that we know, decades later, literally, it was handed over to private enterprise for marketing and profit. And that continues. So for example, if in the 1950s, if you walked around MIT or other major research institutions and took a look at the buildings that were around, they would be electronic firms, Raytheon, iTech, others, kind of feeding off the research that's done under taxpayer subsidy in the research institutions. If you walk around the same institutions today, you'll see Pfizer, Novartis, other pharmaceutical companies. What's happened is that the cutting edge of research and development has shifted to an extent from electronics to biology. So now taxpayers are funding unwittingly the high-tech biology-based economy of the future, which will be privatized and handed over to private enterprise for marketing and profit. It's more complicated than that, obviously. Nothing is as simple as a couple of sentences. But this is a large part of the way the American so-called market economy works. And we're not alone on that by any means. We happen to be more advanced. Also goes way back in history.
Would we be safe in saying that without military funding, the theory of transformational grammar might not have occurred?
Well, if it hadn't been for military funding, you wouldn't have computers, much bigger things than transformational grammar. You wouldn't have computers, the internet, satellites, much of the basis for the modern high-tech economy was funneled through the Pentagon. Kind of like these days people are talking about big infrastructure projects, like the interstate highway system. Those of you who are old enough to remember will recall that the interstate highway system was called the National Defense System. It was built, taxpayers were supposed to fund it because it was essential for our defense. You had to move missiles around and things like that. So the National Defense Highway System. Of course, what it really was a way to undermine efficient transportation, like rail transportation, electric railways and so on, and shift the energy system to the use of fossil fuels, massive waste of fossil fuels. That's a large part of the Anthropocene that we're suffering from today. The National Defense Highway System was a part of that. There were many other parts, real estate things and so on. In fact, as you may know, there was one literal conspiracy, meaning the courts determined that it was conspiracy and fined the perpetrators. This was in Los Angeles, where in the early 1940s, General Motors, Firestone Rubber, and Exxon, what's now ExxonMobil, was an earlier version of it, got together and decided to dismantle the very efficient electric railway system in Los Angeles and replace it with highways, automobiles, trucks, and so on. Those of you who know Los Angeles know what the outcome is. That was a literal conspiracy. They were brought to court. The court determined that it was an illegal conspiracy and actually sentenced them. They fined them. My recollection is it was about $5,000, enough to pay for the victory dinner, maybe, something like that. But this is the way the economy functions pretty generally. And again, it's not us, it's not just us. It goes back to early history. Many illusions about these things.
Yeah. There does seem to be a sort of a cyclical pattern historically with nationalism and now authoritarian regimes, sort of a trend toward more of those. You look at Brexit, Poland, Philippines, and so forth, and perhaps here in the United States. Do you see this as a cyclical event, or do you see this as something that is growing ever closer to the precipice of dictatorship and so forth?
Well, there is what's called a rise of populism, nationalism, fear of the foreigner. It's very easy to instigate in the United States. The U.S. has always been a very frightened society, maybe the safest country in the world, but very frightened. It doesn't take much to scare people. If you think that Europe is very much different, you should take a look at the polls there. Recent polls in Europe showed the majority of the population wants to keep all Muslims out of Europe. All, okay, even worse than here. And people can easily be frightened. This morning's New York Times, you might have noticed an article on the front page about a group in Canada, in some town in Canada, which is mobilizing to prevent the imposition of Sharia law. There's a slight problem. There aren't any Muslims around, but you can never be too careful. One of the American states, I think maybe Oklahoma, has actually passed laws to ban Sharia law, which is just imminent, as you can tell. This morning, I got an email from a guy who was coming to interview me. He was born in Germany. He lives in England, British citizenship. He's a member of the Syrian Writers Organization, bitterly anti-Assad, and he's, go back a generation or two, he's Syrian. He was stopped at Heathrow Airport by Homeland Security and barred from coming to the United States. We can't be too careful. Who knows who'll be coming here to kill us, you know. It's kind of the same mentality as carrying a gun into Starbucks. If you have a cup of coffee, you know, they may be coming for us. There are roots of this in American history, and deep roots. And as I say, England is not much different. But the question we should really be asking, obviously, is why is this showing up everywhere right now? And there's some pretty good reasons for that. It has to do with the actual consequences. Maybe you can argue whether they were intended, but they were certainly predictable, of the social and economic policies that were instituted in the late 1970s, the so-called neoliberal programs, the Washington Consensus, as they were called. A lot of fakery about it, but large part was let the market handle everything. As I've already indicated, it's very far from that. And if you look closely, there's massive subsidy to the very rich and powerful. But for the rest, let the market take care of them. You have an extreme version of it if you take a look at the Freedom Caucus proposals today for health care. Why should there be any right to health care? If people don't have enough money to pay, it's their problem. They should have made better investments or found better parents or something like that. It's not the problem of society. That's the radical counterpart, opposite end of the spectrum to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in fact to what most people believe. But that's a strain in American history and elsewhere. The fear of Polish workers in England, let's say, the workers who are coming to do dirty work that English don't want to do. And you get ideas that they're somehow taking over our pure England. There's a background for all of this. The people who feel this have indeed suffered from the impact of the neoliberal programs. So if you take the United States, the richest, most privileged country, and the one that in many ways was least harmed by these programs, even though they largely originated here. Go back to 2007. That's right at the peak of euphoria about the wonderful economy that St. Alan Greenspan is running. Economists were calling it the new moderation. We've learned how to control the economy. Everything's going to be fine from now on. This is right before the crash, which ruined everything, and incidentally undermined the entire intellectual edifice with no impact, which is quite an interesting phenomenon in intellectual history, but we'll put that aside. Take a look at 2007 and look at real wages for American workers. These are non-supervisory workers, guys that were working on the assembly line, building things and so on. Their wages were actually lower. Real wages were lower than they were in 1979 when these neoliberal programs were initiated. So there's been, and it's a symbol of what's been happening all over. There's been stagnation or decline for a large part of the population, showing up in all sorts of ways. We now have this remarkable phenomenon in the United States of middle-aged, mostly white male workers whose mortality is increasing. That never happens in developed societies, but mortality is increasing for this sector of the population, and it's mostly diseases of hopelessness and despair. These are people who don't want to get a handout from the government, have contempt for people who do, and angry at them. They want a dignified life where they can have self-respect in what they're doing, feel they're doing something important. It's all been taken away from them by very specific policy. Similar things are happening in England. It's the background for Brexit. In Europe, the austerity programs that were imposed by the Troika, the governing authorities, have devastated the economy. Economically, they make no sense at all. Even the International Monetary Fund economists have coming out with papers saying they don't make any sense. But the IMF bureaucrats, who are not the economists, they're part of the Troika. They're implementing them, along with the European Commission, which is unelected, and the bank, which is, of course, unelected. And that goes back to the first part of the Universal Declaration again, along with this attack on fundamental, basic human rights, the rights to a dignified life, which our societies could easily provide with their resources. Along with that, there's been a sharp attack on democracy, and people are aware of it. And you can run through the evidence, which shows it very clearly. One of the reactions is general hatred and contempt for institutions, pretty much across the board. They're not working for us. We hate them. And out of that can come many things. Some of the things that come out of that are very destructive and dangerous. But other things that come out of it are extremely hopeful. We should pay close attention to what happened in the last elections here. The most startling event in the elections was not the election of Trump. It was the success of Bernie Sanders. That breaks from literally a century or more of U.S. political history. U.S. political history has been well studied by very good political scientists, Tom Ferguson and others. A very good predictor of electoral success is just campaign funding, and also of policies undertaken. There are other factors which converge to stress that outcome even more, way before Citizens United, which kind of opened floodgates. But it goes back a long time. Sanders came along, no funding, no corporate funding, no wealthy funding, dismissed, disregarded by the media, a guy who was totally almost unknown. He was using scare words like socialist, which means New Deal Democrat. And he could, if it hadn't been for party shenanigans, party managers, he might very well have won the election. That's not only a radical change from American history, but also a very promising and hopeful sign for the future. And it's extended by popular attitudes today. There was a poll a couple of weeks ago by Fox News, of all people, who tried to find who was the most popular political figure in the United States. And one person was way ahead of anyone else, Bernie Sanders. And among young people, even more. All of that, that's another form of what takes place when social and economic conditions are bringing about stress, despair, anger, fear. One kind of reaction is violence and xenophobia, racism, and so on. Another kind of reaction is futility. Let's just give up. It's too big for us. Third kind of reaction is let's do something about it. And there's every reason to think that that can be done. So there are no reasons for real despair, very hopeful signs, I think.
That's great. You have a habit of being so comprehensive in discussing these topics and leading to the next logical topic that you just already addressed my next two questions, one being on the concentration of wealth and the ownership of the media by a few, and its role in the role of money more broadly in elections. And you've just pointed out one way around that, but it's a very difficult course still when you've got the media controlled by corporations, and most of those corporations have the same interests as other corporations. And so what's the prognosis in terms of how you practically, what strategy is there to roll that back?
Well, I think there are two parallel tracks, both of which have been followed. One is to change the media, and I think that's been done. There's a lot wrong with the media, the major media. I'm talking about New York Times, CBS, Washington Post. Plenty wrong with them, but I think they're a lot better than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Part of the reason is that the society has just become more civilized. The impact of the activism of the 1960s and later years has simply been to educate people, to change their attitudes on all sorts of things. So, for example, take say the two kind of core basic crimes of American history, two horrible crimes: near extermination of the indigenous population and slavery, indescribable crimes. But back in the 1960s, they weren't particularly regarded as crimes. So if you look at the leading anthropologists, the best scholars in the 1960s, what they were saying about indigenous population in the United States, not just the United States, the whole continent, was maybe 1 million people, hunter-gatherers, straggling around. They didn't possess the land, so it didn't mean anything to take away from them. That's no longer true, either of scholarship or even what kids read in school. It's a long way to go, but the history has been very significantly, the false history has been very significantly overcome. It's now possible for not just scholars, but high school students to learn a good deal of what really happened. And there is a reaction. So, for example, the state of Arkansas, a couple of months ago, the legislature initiated a legislation, I don't know what happened to it, to ban Howard Zinn's books from the schools. You didn't have to do that 30 years ago, because they couldn't have possibly entered into the schools. That's a sign of progress, significant progress. Pretty much the same is true of slavery. The real nature of American slavery is just being exposed in recent years by serious scholarship. I mean, it's not that a lot of things weren't known, you know, they were, but they were kind of hidden in arcane places. Now it's becoming public knowledge on the basis of very serious work, which is bringing out entirely new information. These are big changes. Well, that affects the media too. The people in the media grew out of this culture. They're more civilized than they were in the 1960s and 50s. And the other path is just creation of alternative media, which is far easier now than it was then, far easier, and can be done very effectively. Things like, say, Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Are a real means for many people to get a view of the world that they wouldn't have gotten before, and many other things like that. Glenn Greenwald's Intercept, many others that you all know about. So there's plenty of things that can be done. It's just a matter of grasping the nettle, doing the things that you have opportunities for.
Yeah, it is interesting how with these populist changes and the way in which the candidates have continued to stoke really historical roots of racism and anti-Semitism, and the substantial rise in both of those areas, in Europe as well as here in the United States. That's a really frightening thing.
Well, let's take anti-Semitism. I mean, I'm in my late 80s, so I can remember the 1930s, and it was pretty scary. Not just what was happening in Europe, which was terrifying, but what was in ordinary life here. So my father my parents were teachers, Hebrew teachers. And so they kind of survived the Depression. You know, they didn't starve. In fact, the whole family was coming around and being helped by the few people who had jobs. Around 1937, I guess, my father had enough money to buy a second-hand car. We lived in Philadelphia. And my parents decided to take us on the weekend out to the nearby mountains, just Poconos, just to spend a weekend's vacation. So we had to get to a motel. There were the motels you had to look at carefully because there were signs on them that said restricted. Restricted meant no Jews. You didn't have to say no blacks. That question didn't arise, you know. But no Jews. That's late 1930s. I could tell you personal anecdotes of what it was like to grow up on the streets as a young Jewish boy in an Irish Catholic neighborhood. Not very nice. But when I got to Harvard in the early 1950s, the anti-Semitism was overwhelming. There was practically no Jewish faculty. In fact, one of the reasons why MIT became a major university is that outstanding people like, say, Norbert Wiener and others couldn't possibly get jobs at Harvard. Well, that was anti-Semitism in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There are problems now, but it's nothing like that. Absolutely nothing like that. It's much better than it was. So it's not something to laugh at by any means. Those who have experienced it and lived through the periods of the hideous atrocities in Europe are certainly not going to disparage it, but we have to recognize that it's become radically different. By now, Jews are one of the most privileged, maybe the most privileged minority in the country. And pretty much the same is true of so-called European anti-Semitism. So I think we should certainly not disregard it, but recognize how far we've come, and not only how far we've come, but why the progress was made. That's what's critical, because those are the things that we can continue to carry forward instead of succumbing to futility and despair.
Yeah. Building on that discussion, I'd like to talk about what is a sort of another rising area of resistance, at least perceived resistance in some ways, and that's the rise in boycotts of various different areas. And you were quoted in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently, noting that you had come out against the BDS, the boycott, divestiture, and sanctions, arguing that failed initiatives, which is how you characterize much of the BDS movement, harmed the victims doubly by, quote, shifting attention away from their plight into other issues such as anti-Semitism and academic freedom, and by wasting current opportunities to do something meaningful. You want to elaborate on that, or give us your thoughts and how you arrived at that position?
Well, in mentioning boycotts, we shouldn't overlook the fact that, again, as you all know, there is a boycott movement right here of distinguished geographers who have called for a boycott of the American Geographical Association in protest against the kind of regulations and procedures that the Trump administration is instituting. In the case of this Syrian, actually British writer of Syrian origin, who I mentioned before, is an indication of what's happening. That's an issue to certainly be thought about. How should professional societies react to this kind of thing? So, for example, should professional society meetings take place in the United States? It's a serious question. Should they take place in a country where people from designated countries designated by the authorities are not allowed to come freely? The Latin American Studies Association years ago began to have conferences elsewhere because of the restrictions against Cuban scholars. I think those are all things to be thought about. Now, the BDS movement is a different matter. First of all, we have to make a distinction between the tactics, BDS tactics, and the BDS movement. They happen to be quite different things. So BDS tactics in the Israel-Palestine case were actually initiated in 1997 by an Israeli group, Gush Shalom, Uri Avneri's group, strongly anti-occupation, militantly anti-occupation, played a very significant role, still do. They proposed boycotts of the settlements and divestment from anything involving the settlements. And that's been, I myself have been involved in it's really BD activities. There are no real sanctions. That's a state matter. But I've been involved in these things since the late 90s when it took off, aimed at the settlements. Now here questions arise. The BDS movement, which developed in 2005, has a different approach. That's the movement, not the tactics. Their approach calls for, if you read the list of principles, there is a set of principles, if you take it literally, they're calling for boycott of Israel, divestment from Israel, sanctions on Israel, until then comes a long list of conditions, some of which everyone knows are totally unrealizable. Like one of the conditions that's listed in this almost catechism is return of the refugees in accord with international law. Well, first of all, it's not in accord with international law. That's a separate question. But return of the refugees. You can think whatever you like about the morality of that, but everyone knows it is not going to happen. There's no international support for it. If there ever were serious support, Israel would go all out using nuclear weapons, anything else, to prevent it. So it's not going to happen. And dangling this hope in front of people living in miserable refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan is not a good idea or a moral position, in my view. If you take a look at BDS is not a principle, it's a tactic, just as it was in the case of South Africa. It's a tactic. Tactics have to be designed so that they're going to have favorable effects for the victims. The tactics aren't designed so that the person who undertakes them can feel good. That's not a way to design tactics, at least if you have ethical imperatives. You ask yourself, what's the impact on the victims? And if you take a look, there's a record of significant success, very significant success of BD, really BD tactics aimed at the settlement. Say the Presbyterian Church, for example, big organization, has taken a very strong stand on divestment and boycott of anything having anything to do with the settlements, and crucially, they aim also at U.S. institutions, U.S. multinationals that are involved in the occupied territories. That's very significant, both for educational reasons and tactical reasons. And that's been a big success. And there are other successes like that. And I think those are very good, sensible tactics. The European Union has taken some steps in that direction. The human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have advocated similar things. All of that makes a lot of sense, I think, in principle, and it's tactically effective, and it should go way beyond. So if there's ever going to be any significant progress in Palestinian rights, it's going to require a major change in the United States. As long as the United States continues, as it has been doing for decades, to provide economic, diplomatic, military, even ideological support for the settlement projects, they're not going to end. They may use different words, but they're not going to end. They're going to continue. And the U.S. does not have to do that. American citizens can prevent that. In fact, one critical tactic that I think ought to be pursued, I've been advocating this for years, is simply imposing American law. American law, so-called lay amendment, bans any military aid to any military unit or group that is involved in systematic human rights violations. Well, I don't have to go through the record, but anyone who's looked at the wars in Gaza, or what goes on in the West Bank, has no doubt, in Lebanon as well, has no doubt that the Israeli army has been engaged in systematic human rights violations. So therefore, by American law, we ought to cancel military aid to them. Even a move in that direction could have significant implications, very significant. It's a little bit like the Sanders story or the press. There are plenty of things we can do if you think them through, ask what the consequences are, what the possibilities and opportunities are, and then pursue them seriously. Not because something makes you feel good, but because it's beneficial to the victims. That's the question that should be uppermost all the time.
I'd like to ask a question now about, we have many of our members come from China these days, and we're really glad to have them as part of our organization. I want to get your thoughts on the rise of China, which has been remarkable from an economic perspective, and the its extensive investments it now has around the world. And do you imagine a time in the near future when the dominant economy and the dominant sort of international network, let's call it, will it sort of transcend that of the U.S. and Europe?
Well, if you go back a couple of centuries, 17th century, China and India were the most advanced commercial and industrial centers in the world. England had to steal technology from India for its own industrial development, textiles, shipbuilding, and others. I mean, it was so extreme that even during the Napoleonic Wars, when England was really sometimes in dire straits, Parliament banned import of superior Indian ships so as to protect the but the new British shipbuilding industry. Well, of course, that all changed through colonialism. And now China is beginning to recover something like its traditional role, the Middle Kingdom, to which others pay tributary. It's in many ways a pretty ugly process and threatening. In many ways, it's had its positive consequences. Will China, there are now books coming out, in fact there have been for decades, recent one, Gideon Rachman and others, talking about the Asian century, that the center of power is going to shift. First it shifted from Europe to the United States, now it's going to shift over the Pacific. I don't think there's much reason to believe that. China has quite a very big economy by purchasing power parity, roughly like the United States, but it's a very poor country. Take a look at the UN Human Development Index. China, I think, is around 90th. India is maybe 130th. And they've been pretty well stuck there. They have plenty of huge problems that we don't face. Also ecological problems. They don't have much in the way of rich agricultural resources the way we do. And that's being destroyed. China is taking sensible, significant steps towards addressing the environmental catastrophe. It's kind of astonishing that today the world is looking to China for salvation as the United States is going backwards. That's an astounding fact. And China is doing it, but they have plenty of problems. I think it'll be a long time before they become anything like the Western powers in wealth and privilege. Now, United States power has been declining. You've all heard the phrase America's decline, common lament. You can get Foreign Affairs, the main international affairs journal, had a front page cover a couple of years ago called "Is America Over?" or something like that. This is all fear-mongering. American power has declined from its peak, which was after the Second World War. You have to go back and think what it was like. The Second World War was very beneficial to the U.S. economy. The U.S. wasn't much touched by the war. Other industrial economies were devastated or destroyed. U.S. manufacturing practically quadrupled, pulled us out of the Depression. There was a big backlog of technology, other possibilities for the great growth rate of the following years. The U.S. had, the statistics weren't very good in those days, but some estimate that the U.S. may have had almost half of world wealth. Probably not that high, but something like that. Well, of course, that declined. That was never going to last. And it declined very quickly. In fact, the first step in the decline was China. In 1949, an event took place which is called in modern U.S. history the loss of China, which is a very revealing phrase. And I notice that nowadays it's sometimes put in quotes because it's so ludicrous. But for many decades, it was called the loss of China, meaning we owned China and we lost it. That's the assumption. China became independent. And then a major theme in modern American history was who lost China. That's what drove so-called McCarthyism. It went on way into the 60s. John F. Kennedy, when he was escalating the war in Vietnam, was saying he didn't want to be accused of being the person who lost Indochina as if it's ours to lose. That declined. That was a serious blow to U.S. power. But the U.S. still remained by far the most powerful country in the world. If you look at U.S. by the 1970s, the international economy was becoming what's often called tripolar, three major centers. North America, based in the United States, Europe, based mainly in Germany, and East Asia, which at that time was based mainly in Japan. Now it's Japan, the Asian tigers and a rising China. And that was, Northeast Asia was already the most dynamic industrial area. But a lot of it is derivative. So if you take, China is a huge assembly plant. If you take, say, your iPad, it's the company who designs it is Apple, biggest corporation in the world. They farm out production to Foxconn and other subsidiaries, big Taiwanese companies. They hire cheap labor in China where it's assembled. If you take a look at the profit that comes back from the iPhones, China gets very little. Foxconn gets more. Apple gets most of it. That's why they're the richest corporation in the world. Then they make sure they don't pay taxes by setting up their offices in Ireland and so on. China is developing undoubtedly, and it's a significant fact. Most of the decline in global poverty over the last generation has been China, which is not insignificant, but they have plenty of problems. And there's another issue which is barely discussed and is crucially important. It's been brought up particularly by a young political economist named Sean Starrs, who's done very interesting work in which he investigates who owns the world's economy. He points out that we have moved from a period where national economies were the major entities in world global economy. They never were totally, of course, and we haven't totally moved away from it. But there's been a drift towards an international economy where multinational corporations play an independent role. They're based in states. They rely on states. Taxpayers have to support them and so on. So they are based in national states, but they have global reach. They set up these complicated supply chains. That's how you get the iPhone story, for example. So he asked a simple question. How much of the global economy is owned by US corporations? Turns out to be about 50%. That's probably higher than the share of the global economy that was owned by the United States at the peak of its power. In virtually every sector, manufacturing, retail, finance, US corporations are either first or second. The Chinese corporations are way behind, you know. And that's a different measure, which isn't being used very much, but you should keep in mind when you think about what the economy, how the global system's developing. There's another dimension, military, and that's critical. And in that, the United States is way ahead of anyone else. I mean, US military spending is almost as high as most of the rest of the world combined. And now one of Trump's programs is to build up what he calls our debilitated military, which already overwhelms any conceivable combination of powers. And technologically, it's way more advanced in every possible way, you know, space, everything else, cyber war, pick it. And of course, the US is the only country that has hundreds of military bases all over the world. Other countries may have one or two or something. We have maybe 800, if you count the lily pads, many more. And military operations going on all over the world constantly. Now that dimension, the US is absolutely supreme. It's not something we should be proud of, and it's not something healthy for the society, but it's a fact. So I don't see, to get back to the question, much chance of an Asian century in the sense in which people are lamenting. Not that it might not be a bad idea, incidentally.
Great, thanks. I'd like to, one of the things that's remarkable to me over the series of interviews we've done over the years, going way back, is your consistency. I mean, I keep trying to trip you up on a question that I'd asked earlier and see if you'd changed much, and then not so much, you know. And,
that's not a good characteristic either. It's called stubbornness.
Yeah, we'll get to that. When very first interview we did, it was for an anarchist magazine called Black Rose, and one of the first questions I asked you was, I'm going to read it, And I think you still, to this day, you identify as a libertarian socialist, as a tag, as a kind of an identity and so forth. And
to the extent that you have to identify yourself, if you have to pick a name, that's okay.
that's okay.
Actually, I should say that
well, I'm going to read you something
a
from
friend of mine who's a philosopher had to contribute an essay to a collection of philosophical essays commenting on work of mine. And he opened his essay by saying that he had a problem because the only ism I seem to believe in is truism, which is not too wrong.
There you go. Yeah. In any case, this article, the first question was about anarchism and its role, its potential relevance, if any, to our current world. And you answered that with some interesting ideas about how it might be relevant to an advanced technological society. And I'll just read the question quickly and summarize your answer. 1974. In your essay on Notes on Anarchism, you were pretty sympathetic to anarchism. And then we talked about how there are some roots in geography with Kropotkin, Reclus, and so forth being anarchists and geographers. You talk about reintegrating anarchism into the 20th century. Do you see anarchism as being relevant to social problems in the advanced capitalist countries? Your answer was, as you know, anarchism covers a broad spectrum. That particular strain of, this was Daniel Guerin at the time, isolated and studied, I think is a valuable one. It's one that converges pretty much with libertarian Marxism, I think. Marxism also covers a pretty broad spectrum, and there's a point at which some varieties of anarchism and some varieties of Marxism come together. This is a topic that we might raise with David Harvey in his talk tomorrow. You're welcome to come. Okay. And so they come together. And out of that complex of ideas, anarcho-syndicalist ideas and libertarian socialist ideas, it seems to me that there's a very applicable, in fact, I think those are exactly the appropriate ideas for an advanced technological society. It seems to me that anarchism, in that sense, suggests certain principles of organization that are extremely realistic, sort of a natural evolution with a high enough level of technology and communication and elimination of onerous but necessary labor. Under those conditions, it seems to me entirely possible and in fact essential to move toward these social forms so very much appropriate to an advanced industrial society. Do you hold those views still?
Yeah, I still think, in fact, I think there's interesting steps in that direction.
Yeah, I do.
So, for example, take this huge problem of deindustrializing America, and just take a look at some of the things that have happened. So, for example, in 1977, I think it was, U.S. Steel decided to close down their plants in Youngstown, Ohio, major steel city built by working class unions, labor in the steel and other manufacturing industries. The union offered to buy the plant and to hand it over to the workforce. The company didn't like that, probably for class reasons. There's case after case where multinational, major corporations, which are often run by financiers, banks and so on, prefer not to make profit if it will undermine class struggle. So the idea that workers could take over and run a plant successfully is not an idea that they want to foster. And for that, they're willing to take a cut in profits, or so it looked. It hadn't been studied carefully. Anyway, it went to court. The corporation won. Stoughton Lind, who was the lawyer for the advocate for the union, continues to live there and fight for it. But they didn't give up after that. They turned to something else, establishing small worker-owned enterprises in the old Rust Belt, the northern Ohio area around Cleveland, integrated into the kind of economy that's developing there, kind of a service economy. And some of this is working very well. Goral Perovitz has written very effectively about it, both the theory and the practice. And these are things that certainly can be done, and they could be done on a very large scale. So take a couple of years ago, in the midst of the crash, as you recall, the government, Obama, basically nationalized the auto industry, pretty much took it over. There were some choices at that point, and the choice that was taken was determined by the ideological structure and the power structure internal to the country, which could have been different. If people like us were acting, it could have been different. There were two choices, basically. One choice, the one that was taken, was to bail out the companies, hand them back to the same banks and managerial elite who ran them before, some different faces, but essentially the same institutions, and have them proceed to produce cars. Okay? That's what was done. There was a much more sensible option, both in human, political, and even environmental terms. Hand the auto industry over to its workforce and the community, have them run it, and have them produce what the country needs, which is not more cars to make traffic jams, but decent mass transportation, which would make a much better life and a much healthier life and a significant contribution to reducing the threats that we face. Well, that was never considered. But if it wasn't considered, it's the fault of people like us. We're the kind of people who should be acting to make it be considered. And these things happen all the time, on a small scale, on major scale, and this is all moves towards developing what Bakunin, great anarchist thinker, once called building the facts of the future within the present society. Cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, other kinds of developments like that can begin to build a better future within this society. The same is true of the problem of the massive problem of climate destruction. The federal government right now happens to be a wrecking ball. They want to destroy everything as fast as possible, okay, in the interest of short-term profit. That's transparent. But that doesn't mean it has to stop. States can do things, localities can do things, small groups can do things, individuals can, and they can make a huge difference, a very big difference. In fact, maybe enough of a difference to prevent the wrecking ball from destroying all of us. Yeah. But it has to be done. Even simple things like go ahead.
All right. There are a lot of institutions, and I'd like to say even our institution, which works in the interstices between corporations and large governments and so forth, and are in some ways a very oppositional force to what is occurring now. And I think that if you look at the DIY, do-it-yourself economies that are developing in Baltimore and Brooklyn and in Detroit. I was born in Flint, Michigan, and grew up, saw the demise of everything. And I was just there again recently, and it's remarkable how strong the city is finally starting to come back.
Really?
Really, and I've heard, and I'm skeptic because I've heard it's something going to happen for 30 years now, and now it really is. In fact, I think we should hold a meeting in Detroit at one point in time, and if we do, and of course our members never complain about anything. But occasionally I get word that the hotels are too expensive. So my approach is we hold a meeting in Detroit. And
well, hotel prices are going down because people are refusing to come to the United States.
Oh, not yet. So we'll discuss this offline. But I thought, well, one way we could save money, we could just buy everybody a house for $100, and they would have that for the meeting and done. But now, unfortunately for us, and fortunately for the city, there's been a massive movement into downtown Detroit from people from all of the other DIY, Brooklyn, Baltimore, Berlin, moving into the city, as well as people from the surrounding areas. And the vacancy rate is about 1%. And all kinds of small industries are there. It's really quite impressive now. But on that note, then, I want to, Noam, I got a bone to pick with you.
Pardon?
I've got a bone to pick with you.
Okay.
It's been bothering me for a long time. And that is that for my whole life, wherever I go, people come up to me, they walk up to me, I'm in a cafe, I'm minding my own business, not bothering anybody. And they say, are you Noam Chomsky? I get it all the time, are you Noam Chomsky? No. I said, no, I'm not. But it keeps coming. Are you Noam Chomsky? And I said, well,
it's going to get worse.
First, I said, first, I said, no, I'm his son. That didn't work out. And then I tried other approaches, and finally, I sort of began to reconcile myself to it when about, maybe 15 years ago, your hair turned white. My hair was still brown. And I want you to know my hair is still brown. I dyed it white, so I look like you again. But what happened is people started coming to me, and they would say, are you Woody Allen? Are you Woody Allen? I said, no, I'm not Woody Allen. I'm Noam Chomsky.
Well, my wife, Valeria, who's over there, who knows Woody Allen and has in fact worked with him, and she has an idea in mind to try to convince him to have a film in which he plays me, or maybe I play him, I'm not sure.
Well, my next sentence was going to be a request that, I could perhaps, I work a lot of hours at the AG, nobody knows that, around the clock, weekends and everything else. And so I was thinking maybe I could go away for a couple months, You could come in my place, and people might not even know that I'm gone, But anyway. But I also want to ask you another personal question, if you don't mind, before we wrap up. You've worked so hard for so many years. You've done so many wonderful things, and been in the forefront of necessary battles. And I just wonder if you've ever just thought about, maybe going to the south of France for a while, retire, and maybe go to some kind of South Sea island, maybe take up the arts or a musical instrument, or who knows what. Maybe we'll pursue a whole new career path. And the reason I ask that, there are some rumors coming around that you are considering other possible forms of employment. And there was a very respectable, owned by the Washington Post, publication that in print itself, right on the print page, carried a story about your possible next gig in Las Vegas. Now I want to know, there's a lot of fake news. We hear about fake news all the time, and I just want
to show the picture.
It's showing. Oh, isn't it up there? Oscar? Okay. So, there is a lot of fake news, and I just wanted to confirm whether this was a rumor or whether you're seriously taking on a whole new kind of profile.
We'll see.
We'll see. Okay, thanks for being such a good sport.
Yeah.
Did you see this before? No, oh, it's an onion. It's a whole story. You got to read this. You got to read the story too. The Onion is a kind of a spoof type I think it is actually owned by the Washington Post. And so we're now at a point where I want to take a few minutes to make an award to you, and then we'll have some questions, okay? But we're going to get the award in first. The AG has has its most prestigious award is the AG Atlas Award, which was launched in 2010. And it's designed to recognize and celebrate outstanding, internationally recognized leaders who advance world understanding in exceptional ways. Not American exceptional, but in exceptional ways. The image of Atlas bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders is a powerful metaphor for this award program, as our nominees are those who've taken the weight of the world on their shoulders and moved it forward, whether in science, politics, scholarship, or the arts. Earlier recipients of the award included primatologist Jane Goodall, international human rights and political leader Mary Robinson, and civil rights icon Julian Bond. So you're in good company. Noam Chomsky has been selected as this year's recipient of the AG Atlas Award. As you know, he's one of the world's leading public intellectuals. He has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, science, and everything. Chomsky's wide-ranging intellect and impassioned work has long inspired geographers, and his highly regarded contributions on contemporary topics concerning globalization and the intersections between geography, economics, and politics are of great interest to AG members. For these reasons and many, many more, we're proud and pleased to recognize Professor Noam Chomsky with the 2017 AAG Atlas Award. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll bring it up. Okay. So, okay. Can you take this? So this comes off. There's a world on his shoulders. And so we got to put this up here. First we put the world on his shoulders. Get a picture of this. And this is the this is the most androgynous atlas that I was able to find. So there you go. So, and also with that, we also have of course, a nice thing to put under that pile of books that you've been waiting to get rid of, and then so.
Thank you all very much.
And then we have a
great honor.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
See if I can help keep it up.
We'll need it. We'll have them pack it up for you. We'll put this up here while you're taking questions. They need to know that this is Atlas. So now we'd like to take a few questions. And this is a check on them.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, do we have the people at the microphones set up and ready to go? Where should people go? Okay, it's hard for me to see with these lights here. So since I can't see, just have people line up and we'll start on either aisle. Okay, let's start over here, please.
Hi, Noam. Danny Bednar, Department of Geography, Western University. I can't decide if I want to ask you about the geopolitics of outer space, which is my subfield, and I don't know if it's something you've thought about too much. You did mention space technologies in your discussion of U.S. Army supremacy. I want to ask if you have thought about the expansion of neoliberalism and hegemony into that next step and using that space, not in the literal sense, as a means of control and dominance. And also what you think in this kind of new promotion of Martian colonialization. I know it's sometimes something that gets a laugh, but within it are interesting narratives of colonialism, an extension of the existing modes of power, And I wanted to ask you if you've ever thought of those types of things and what your thoughts are.
Well, if you take a look at the military planning, the quadrennial reviews, they regard control of space as a critical element in running the world. They want, the ways of directing weapons that can hit a narrowly identified target within minutes from controls in outer space, massive surveillance, all sorts of other ideas. And no doubt that's all being developed. In fact, you can read about it even in the public documents. As far as inhabiting other planets are concerned, personally, I would regard it as this sort of basically a joke, except for the fact that there are some pretty respectable people who take it seriously. So Stephen Hawking, for example, is one of the great contemporary scientists, has argued, I presume seriously, that since humans are heading for extinction by their own decisions, the only way the species can survive is by finding some other planet. Personally, I can't take that seriously, but Hawking's a serious person. There is an effort to kind of privatize space travel, but it's kind of games for multi-billionaires.
Okay, we'll take a question over here now.
Dr. Chomsky, in 1967, you published The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And a lot of us are grappling with issues of how to be more engaged scholars, especially during this time with such alarming circumstances. And that's out there for people to read in print, but I wonder if you have any updates to that you'd like to add for the 21st century, and if you could just comment in general about the responsibility of intellectuals.
Well, actually, the Boston Review of Books, which is the Boston counterpart to the New York Review of Books, a couple of years ago asked me to write an update, which they in fact published. And it is the first chapter in a recent book called Who Rules the World? So it kind of looks at the problems from a fairly recent point of view. I think this must have been 2007. If I were to write it today, again, you can find different circumstances all the time, but I think the basic issues remain about the same. People who are called intellectuals are called that because they have a certain degree of privilege. Like maybe the janitor who cleans the floor of somebody's office understands world affairs and human affairs much better than the Nobel Prize scientist who sits behind the desk. But he's not called an intellectual. So intellectuals are people who have a sufficient degree of privilege and justified or not authority so that they have opportunities to articulate views, opinions, reach people with commentary and discussion of the world scene, and also become involved directly in activism in ways which can help inspire others. Those are consequences of privilege. And privilege confers responsibility. Straightforwardly. It means you can do more things than people without privilege can. And I think that's the essential message. Then comes the question, how this responsibility is used, how's the privilege used? Well, if you look through history, it's not very pretty. Overwhelmingly, all the way back to the earliest historical records, critical, open-minded intellectuals have suffered in one way or another. How depends on the nature of the society. Okay. But they have also made many achievements.
I'd like to ask the first woman in this line to step forward. We got a whole bunch of men got up there first.
Hello, my name is Julia. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. And I wonder if we may say that we are going through an epoch of extremes right now. Extreme uncertainty, extreme lack of ideologies and collective cosmologies and worldviews, extreme movement, but extreme closure at the same time, extreme individualism, extreme poverty, but also extreme concentration of richness and therefore extreme inequality. Extreme territorial and natural exploitation, extreme threats to human life, as you mentioned, in a plethora of ways. So, which would your advice be, or even your warning be, to the new generation of researchers and academics that are here today to listen to you? How can we work better, and how can we be better in view of the clock getting closer to midnight? Does, for instance, these extreme epoch require, in your opinion, more radical positions? And what would it mean to be radical in this sense, if this is any meaningful? Thank you.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard. I mean, I'm often asked for advice, often by young people, and I really don't know what to say. I mean, the kind of people who, like us, say, have every opportunity available to us. We enjoy a legacy of privilege and freedom that was handed down to us by struggles of people under much harsher conditions. I mean, some of the things that are happening today are indeed extreme. It's the first time in human history that we're facing a real prospect of extinction. That's new. On the other hand, the 1930s were in many ways a much more terrifying period. Repression in the United States in the past has been far worse than it is today. People talk about repression, the right to do it, but there's nothing like Wilson's Red Scare or the COINTELPRO operations that went through the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon administration. And the rise of fascism in Europe was really a terrifying matter, even before the Holocaust. And we saw that. So there's all kind of horrible things that have been the case in the past. We have plenty of problems now. We have lots of opportunities. And we have to try to achieve what we can. So, for example, take, say, climate change. I think a pretty good argument can be made that the fundamental principles of capitalist society and market societies are simply inconsistent with human survival. So in that respect, there's a need to make radical changes. But you can't just say, look, let's make radical changes. I mean, radical changes in the structure of society can come about when the large mass of the population is convinced that what exists is not going to be responsive to their just needs and demands. So therefore, we'll change what exists. And activists, call them intellectuals or whatever you like, can try to help this process go forward, but they can't create it out of nothing. So maybe we need radical ideas. Okay, let's prepare the ground for them. That's about all we can do.
I think we've got time for maybe two more questions. One over here.
Hi, Noam. My name is Ian. I'm from the University of Winnipeg, where you've had a big influence, you know, the Propagandy political punk band and the Mondragon movement. And I'm Canadian, and I haven't heard you talk about Trump. So I want to hear your thoughts on Trump. But I want to hear your thoughts about, you know, you've worked in universal grammar. And I'm curious what you think of the possibility of humanity's universal ability to cooperate, the universal ability to have compassion, and can we deal with what's going on in America and its impact on the world?
Well, we better hope that we can, or else the world's in real trouble. And we have no reason to doubt that we can. So we can only try as hard as possible within the options and opportunities available to us. Trumpism is too big a topic for couple of minutes, but there are some very striking things about what's happening in Washington. What's going on is a kind of very systematic, two-tiered operation. One of them is Trump, Bannon, the effort to try to make sure you capture the headlines, you're on the top of the news, one crazy thing after another, just to make sure that people are paying attention. And the assumption is, well, they're going to forget later anyway, so people don't talk anymore about the 3 million illegal immigrants, and pretty soon they'll stop talking about the wiretap, and you'll be on to something else. I mean, while everything is focusing on that, the Paul Ryan Republicans, who are the most, in my view, the most dangerous and savage group in the country, are busy implementing programs that they have been talking about quietly for years, very savage programs which have very simple principles. One, make sure you offer to the rich and powerful gifts beyond the dreams of avarice, and kick everybody else in the face. And it's going on step by step, right behind the bluster. And you take a look at the cabinet was designed that way. Every cabinet official was chosen to destroy anything of human significance in that part of the government. And it's so systematic that it can't be unplanned. I doubt that Trump planned it. My impression is that his only ideology is me, But whoever's working on it is doing a pretty effective job, and the Democrats are cooperating in a very striking way. Take a look at the focus in Congress. It's on the few decent things that Trump has been doing. So maybe members of his transition team contacted the Russians. Is that a bad thing? I mean, the recent ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, really had a vlog where he pointed out it's exactly what you should be doing. That's the job of diplomats and ambassadors and people coming in. There's serious problems and tensions. You want to talk over if there's anything you can do about them, instead of just building up force and violence. So that's what the Democrats are focusing on. And meanwhile, all these other things are going on, and not saying anything about them. We focus on whether, in fact, they're basically letting the Bannon-Trump group control what's presented to the public. Crazy things about wiretapping. Did Susan Rice commit a crime, or whatever tomorrow's will be? Well, meanwhile, the parts of the governmental structure that are beneficial to human beings and to future generations are being systematically destroyed, and with very little attention. I think my feeling is that's what it looks like.
Yeah. We've got time for one more question. I'll take it from over here.
Okay. I just wanted to update you of where you had spoken about a finite set of elements producing infinite combinations back in your linguistic days. I ended up identifying them, testing them, and presenting them yesterday. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, with that, wait a minute, I got one more question. Noam, why did you put my picture on the front of this book? Okay, let's do it. Thank you all for coming.